Thank you so much, Dean Matthew. Justice Breyer and Dean Matthew have other obligations, so they will be departing, but I'm going to invite our panelists to come down at this time for our first panel. We've got our moderator, Lamar Campbell. We have Rachel Schiller, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Programs and Operations in the Paul Mill Bureau. We have Matthew Murray, Adjunct Professor at Columbia University and routine consultant and advisor to the American Bar Association. And last but not least, Jonathan Katz, who is the Senior Director for Anti-Corruption, Democracy and Security, the ACDS project at the Brookings Institution. And is Jonathan joining us online? Oh, where's Jonathan? Does anyone see John? Jonathan is parking, we understand. So we did get out of the blocks, I think, and go a little bit ahead of schedule. But we will welcome Jonathan when he arrives. So Lamarck and Matthew and Rachel, would you be ready to start? Because I want to leave as much time as we can, if there could be some interplay with the audience, because we've got a distinguished group in our audience as well. So does that sound good? All right, over to you, Lamarck. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you all for being here this morning. And I have the distinct pleasure of moderating our first panel, which will look at the nexus between corruption and matters of national security. And my name is Lamar Campbell. I'm the Senior Technical Advisor for Anti-Corruption here at the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. Our distinguished panelists include Rachel Schiller, as she's been introduced, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Programs and Operations, U.S. State Department, Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, and Matthew Murray, Adjunct Professor at Columbia University, and our resident expert anti-corruption consultant at ABA Rowley. So this panel will look at the efforts undertaken by the Biden-Harris administration in the implementation of the new U.S. anti-corruption strategy. Now that it is almost 2.5 years since the strategy has been released, we will look at what has been done under the strategy in its implementation efforts through various departments, such as the State Department, and also which impact has the strategy had in specific regional contexts. So with that, we'll have about 40 minutes for discussion, and then we will conclude with a Q&A session where we will invite the audience to ask our distinguished panelists questions that they may have on this topic. And that Q&A session will be about 15 minutes. With that, I will begin with you, Matthew. Matthew, as you've been working in this area for over 30 years, assisting governments, civil society organizations, private entities on important anti-corruption initiatives. You've also authored the ABA Rowley white paper on strengthening coordination in support of the U.S. strategy. So I think the question to start off this panel would be, given this, what really is your understanding when we say corruption is a national security risk? Also, if you can address, how should we be approaching this risk today? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Lamarck, and thank you to the American Bar Association and George Washington University Law School. And I look forward to our discussion today, and I particularly look forward to cross-examining the witness. I think to answer this very complex question, it's important to put it in a larger context, and to start by saying that corruption is a national security issue. It's also an international security issue. And to truly understand it, it's important to see how it's connected to the globalization, the rise of authoritarianism, and the decline of democracy. And so Jonathan's with us. Come on down, Jonathan. You just got started. So, and so I would to unpack those questions and otherwise do justice to this issue, I will use Russia as a use case. And I will start with the end of the Cold War, because I think it's important to go back in history a little bit to see how corruption has evolved as a national security issue. At the end of the Cold War, the West was pretty sure that capitalism had prevailed over communism. And we supported Russian reforms to instill free markets and privatization of industry. We believed that Russia would create institutions that would protect private property and adopt the rule of law. We just heard from Justice Breyer in his first interactions with Russian judicial leaders. They were talking about the end of telephone justice and creation of judicial independence. What we didn't see at the time is that capitalism is not monolithic. There are different forms of capitalism, and they include big corporate, entrepreneurial, state capitalism, and oligarchic capitalism. And the role of government differs profoundly in each of those types of capitalism. What we also did not see was that Russia moved towards oligarchic capitalism. This was shaped by strong feudal pre-czarist traditions that included, or pre-communist traditions that included that period in history when Russian czars controlled the nation's wealth by extracting rents from peasants, by controlling modern industry, and by prohibiting the ownership of private property. And so instead of the rule of law in Russia, we encountered something entirely different. We encountered the iron law of oligarchy, which is that powerful connected network groups control the government and wealth of the state. They operate above the law, and they in effect dictate the law for their own financial interests. And while we, as this iron law of oligarchy was sort of taking root, if you will, both Republican and Democratic administrations here sought to exercise American soft power, American economic power, and provide incentives to Russia to change its conduct to a more rules-based approach. We negotiated Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization. We worked with Russian reformers. We started discussing in 2013 a bilateral U.S.-Russia investment treaty. And so as we were doing that, what was taking place was that it turned out that this iron law of oligarchy made it very difficult to contain this authoritarian tendency in Russia within its own borders. These oligarchic networks needed to access financial markets to export their commodities. They needed to launder money. They needed to move their assets abroad and hide them. They needed to buy real estate. And so, and most pernicious, they needed to, in effect, use proxy networks to seek control over governments in their region and take control of the political institutions and strategic industries in countries nearby. They weaponize corruption. They use tactics, including bribery, money laundering, campaign finance, corrosive investment, and that kind of thing. And of course, the main target of this was Ukraine. And it worked for a while in Ukraine. It worked up and through 2013 when their main proxy, their main crony, Viktor Yanukovych, who was then president of Ukraine, made a sudden decision to reverse course on Ukraine's then path towards EU accession. And when he did that, he was met with huge resistance on the streets, known as the Revolution of Dignity. Revolution of Dignity was a revolution, perhaps the first in history, for the right to engage in free trade, and for the right to be a citizen entrepreneur, for the right to have entrepreneurial capitalism. And so, Russia responded to the Maidan with force. They responded by annexing Crimea, by supporting paramilitary groups in the Donbass region of Ukraine. And but But that still did not stop Ukrainians from pushing their government, from Ukrainian civil society, for advocating for continued accession to the European Union. And despite that show of force by Russia, governance and rule of law and anti-corruption reforms continued in Ukraine. And as they moved in the direction of the accession to the European Union, I believe that the Russian government, led by Putin, saw that as the economic equivalent of Russia joining NATO. And so in February 2022, there was this dramatic escalation of the war that began in 2014. This war is now a decade old, right? So there was this dramatic escalation in an effort to, try, and there's abundant evidence. There's abundant evidence that part of what they were trying to do with this dramatic escalation and full-scale invasion of Ukraine was to essentially destroy the spirit of the Revolution of Dignity and put in place key cronies that they had in waiting, and actually kill off certain anti-corruption leaders in the country. So, Lamarck, to your question of why is it a national security issue? It's not only a national security issue. In my view, it's a cause of war. And the war, the roots of that war are what we now call lawfare, right? And I see lawfare as a conflict between the rule of law and the iron law of oligarchy. And in Ukraine, tragically, lawfare turned into a hot war. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matthew, for providing that historical context of corruption not being just a national security issue, but also an international security issue, but ultimately a cause of war. I'll turn it over to you, Rachel, now, so that you can provide the U.S. government perspective on this topic. Given that part of the mission of the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs is to build enduring security partnerships to advance U.S. national security objectives, could you please describe for us the components of the U.S. strategy on countering corruption that the Bureau is spearheading? And also what has been working and what maybe has not been working in that regard? Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Lamarck, so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I just want to add my voice to the thanks to the American Bar Association, George Washington Law School. Thank you for hosting us today. One disclaimer is that I will not be cross-examining the witness. I am not a lawyer. So I look forward to learning from my fellow panelists and all of you as well. And I will do my best to share with you the U.S. government's perspective on this topic today. So just to level set a little bit, I think you all are familiar that in December 2021, the White House released the first ever United States strategy on countering corruption. The strategy provides a comprehensive approach to how the United States will work both domestically and internationally with governmental and non-governmental partners to prevent, limit, and respond to corruption and related crimes. Our efforts are based on the premise that Matthew has just laid out, that corruption poses threats to American interests at home as well as around the world. It erodes opportunities for U.S. businesses, undermines the rule of law, contributes to human rights abuses, and threatens U.S. national security, as well as global security. The strategy is a whole of government effort to prevent and combat corruption internationally and to strengthen the ability of governments around the world to prevent, identify, combat, and prosecute acts of corruption and foreign bribery. The Departments of State, Justice, Commerce, Treasury, and USAID all play leading roles in the implementation of the strategy, which means that one of the challenges that we're facing, as I'll talk about in a little while, is obviously interagency coordination, which is something that is always a challenge for the US government. Just a few words, the Justice Department, I think many of you will know this, and I think Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, Todd Robinson, will be here in the next panel, and we'll talk more about some of these efforts. But at the Justice Department, we're vigorously enforcing our anti-corruption laws. At the Commerce Department, we're promoting the passage and implementation of commercial laws that respect international anti-bribery standards and promote a level playing field for US businesses. At the Treasury and State Departments, we have sanctions and visa restrictions authorities that promote accountability for bad actors by preventing them from accessing our economy or territory. Treasury is also spearheading bold efforts to protect the U.S. financial system from dirty money and engaging the private sector to play their part. And the United States is leading in the international bodies that shape anti-corruption rules and standards. But what I'd like to focus on today is really a piece of the puzzle that I think is often overlooked in anti-corruption efforts, and that is the role of the security sector, specifically the armed forces. My bureau, as Lamarck has laid out, the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, is tasked with building enduring security partnerships with partners and allies around the world. Corruption is one of the biggest challenges that we face in building enduring security partnerships. Corruption makes security forces less effective. It erodes public trust in those security forces and their leaders, and it leaves partners poorly equipped with low morale and frequently unstable governments. You've talked about the Russia example. I will point to the corrupt hollowing out of the Sahelian and West African militaries, which has been a key driver of successive coups in the region. The success of violent extremist organizations, the ability of our adversaries to make inroads in these countries. Examples include the prevalence of ghost soldiers, leading to understrength units with officers collecting pay from empty billets, theft and resale of equipment, leading to non-functional equipment, theft of wages, undermining morale and forcing soldiers to take on second jobs while on duty and failing to train, and corrupt contracting, leading to the acquisition of defense systems that are not suited for applicable national security threats. In conflict-affected contexts, corruptly diverted security assistance carries the additional risk that it could inadvertently worsen conflict dynamics and protect corrupt security force leaders from domestic accountability, undermining the very purpose of that assistance. Arms or other equipment or goods that we've transferred may be at higher risk of being stolen and or sold. Personnel that we've trained may sell or provide their services to non-state groups, and resources may be diverted for personal gain or to fuel violence. The links between corruption and conflict is why fighting corruption has also been incorporated into the U.S. strategy to prevent conflict and promote stabilization, which seeks to strategically align U.S. conflict prevention and stabilization policy and resources in our partner countries. I also want to highlight the impact corruption has on U.S. businesses. When foreign procurement decisions are made on the basis of bribes and kickbacks instead of price and quality, it disadvantages American businesses that are prepared to compete fairly. The national security implications of this, including for the defense sector, are vast. When corrupt actors are allowed to capture entire sectors, it not only harms our commercial interests and makes U.S. businesses vulnerable to shakedowns and extortion, but it limits our ability to compete in sectors like critical minerals, transportation, and defense that are vital to our national interest, allowing our adversaries to gain inroads and influence that often leaves partners vulnerable to undesirable economic and security outcomes. So what are we doing about it? Objective 4.1, to be specific to answer Lamarck's question here. Objective 4.1 of the strategy calls for us to build accountable, effective, and resilient security institutions. Objective 5.5 of the strategy asks us to consider standards for security sector governance in security assistance and arms transfer decisions, and to assess the risk corruption poses to security assistance. To that end, and in partnership with DoD and interagency colleagues, we've built data analytic tools to measure security cooperation outcomes, including security sector governance, and we're looking at corruption risks and transparency as key components of our security sector analysis. The Bureau of Political Military Affairs is also piloting a new country security sector review process to gauge the strengths and weaknesses of a partner's security sector governance, including institutional safeguards against corruption, as well as the partner's willingness to undertake security sector governance reforms. A key goal of the pilot is to develop a process that methodically assesses governance-related risks to security cooperation efforts and identifies effective mitigation measures where possible. We're also building out programs intended to create transparent and accountable security institutions. We're doing this through strategic advisory support to enhance processes, institutions, and areas that are susceptible to corruption, fraud, abuse, waste, and overall poor management. We've implemented advisory support in 35 countries focused on planning, budget, and financial management, human resources management, oversight, accountability, and interagency coordination, and procurement and acquisition. Among other things, we're trying to ensure a level playing field for U.S. businesses by ensuring procurement systems in which contracts go to the right bidder rather than the one that pays a bribe. I'll just say a few words before I sum up here about what is working and what is not. So as we've all highlighted, we're a little bit over 2 years into implementing the strategy. Addressing corruption is very clearly foundational to so many of the United States foreign policy priorities. And this strategy, for the first time, gives us the tools and the imperative to address that underlying challenge. It's given us a common framework to analyze, talk about, and redouble this important work. The strategy has strengthened our coordination, both within the State Department and across the interagency, creating new mechanisms for us to collaborate with and learn from one another and our partners, and driving innovation across the U.S. government. The State Department released a public implementation plan this past September to provide more insight about how we're redoubling our anti-corruption effort as we work to implement the strategy. This is the first time that we've had this level of organization, ambition, and transparency about what we're doing on this critical issue across the entire government. One of our major challenges has been the need, as I mentioned earlier, to break down bureaucratic stovepipes to address security sector corruption holistically. Corruption in our partners' security sectors is never neatly contained to a single institution. The factors that enable any one form of corruption, lack of official oversight, entrenched patronage systems, absence of a robust civil society and press, usually make other types of corruption more likely as well. No single part of the U.S. government has the resources, tools, or know-how to address these systemic drivers of corruption broadly enough to motivate sustainable and sector-wide change, as opposed to cleaning up particular units or processes, which too often turns out to be temporary. We need to get better at both joint analysis and coordinated action. Finally, and I will end with this thought, we need help. Anti-corruption efforts in other sectors rely heavily on the high-quality research efforts and expertise nurtured outside of the government, in think tanks, in CSOs, in development organizations, in universities. Because of the reflexive secrecy around the security sector over many years, it's been relatively neglected or avoided by the advocacy community. We don't have the comparative data, comparative analytical tools, and careful comparison of the efficacy of different corruption mitigation efforts in different contexts that exist in other sectors. We hope that those of you in this room with expertise in other types of corruption will consider turning your attention to the security sector to help us fill this gap. And I will end there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel, for providing that U.S. government perspective on the strengths and the challenges it takes to implement the strategy effectively. And I think I would just want to pick up on the last call that you had was we need help. As this corruption, it's not just a U.S. government or any government problem, but it involves the civil society actors and the private sector, also journalists as well. So I think this really is a good way to segment into Jonathan's part. Jonathan, I know you are now the senior director of this relatively newly established anti-corruption, democracy, and security project at Brookings Institution. I think those three words very much, coincide in what we are discussing today. And as Rachel mentioned, we need help. So can you describe what this new project is doing in the anti-corruption sphere? And also, what specific measures do you believe are most effective in mitigating corruption's impact on national security?
Great, thank you so much. And sorry for my late arrival. It's great to be here. ABA, big thank you to ABA, but also to George Washington University Law School for this opportunity to participate and to be with such great colleagues. And Rachel, your last point really hits home. As somebody who's been in and out of U.S. government, but has worked closely with civil society organizations for the last 2 decades, working on anti-corruption projects, democracy projects, working closely with investigative journalists and other key stakeholders. I think it's so important to know that this is what we call key stakeholders moment, and it has been in sort of implementing these challenges. And in the United States, we're lucky to have a government that is capable of even moving this type of national security strategy in the way that it's been moved. Now, we shouldn't forget that combating corruption has been something the U.S. government has been thinking about for years, but it's taken decades to implement policy from the creation of OFAC at Treasury in 1950 to where we are today in this discussion in this national security strategy. So having worked in this space and having worked with these key actors, and also have seen them struggle in spaces where civil society doesn't have the space to address these challenges, where journalists are locked up. We just had World Press Freedom Day just a short while ago. These are things that are critically important, and having looked at the Biden administration anti-corruption strategy, you can see that it's not only an investment in sort of what the U.S. government can do, but it's been an investment globally in terms of support for civil society, ramping up technical support. And I'll talk a little bit about our project, try not to go too deeply into it, and hopefully to answer questions, but in issues like financial transparency and integrity, standing up something called the FTI Accelerator at USAID, working across the interagency and these various pieces like political military affairs, all the way over to what Commerce Department is doing, USAID, NSC. So I'm a big cheerleader of this strategy. I'm also a little worried about the future of this strategy, because based on how long it has taken to put in place key laws to address these challenges, what we see at Brookings and see through our research is that progress is incremental. It's steady. It's challenged when you see opportunities like we see now in a space like Guatemala. We have a president who's committed to corruption, but you had a decade of corrupt actors running the country. It's a real challenge. So you need to provide that surge. So we are very lucky. I joined Brookings last summer. Right before that, I was on the Hill with Senator Klobuchar, where, of course, this issue was really important to the senator, the anti-corruption efforts. So I was pleased to come over to Brookings to help launch in December the anti-corruption democracy strategy, this project focused on combating corruption and advancing democracy in this nexus with security, which is something that we've tried to do, I think, through this project, is mainstream this idea that national security is directly impacted by corruption in the United States domestically, by what happens globally, by transnational actors, but also by enablers of corruption in our country. So we launched our project in December, happened to be the second anniversary of the Biden administration's national security strategy. So we were tying it directly to that because we were thinking about these links and about the key stakeholders that this project is bringing together and is brought together through a previous project called Leveraging Transparency to Reduce Corruption, which is a previous 5-year Brookings project that focused on bringing key stakeholders together and working on these deeply challenging and thorny corruption issues globally that are impacting democracies. So we were purposeful in making this link, and ACDS has several core programmatic activities. First, to address global anti-corruption challenges, we're focused on global multi-stakeholder community, as I mentioned, and anti-corruption champions, focusing on where we see an opportunity. And Matthew, you mentioned Ukraine. ACDS and LTRCR2, I'll use our acronyms, was heavily involved in supporting and working with Ukrainian civil society post the war. We thought it was important, even in my previous job at the German Marshall Fund, where I was leading democracy initiatives, to surge support for Ukrainian civil society, to make certain that their anti-corruption and democracy reforms were not only addressed, but moving in the right direction despite the war. So we did a number of papers, joint papers with partners in Ukraine, bringing together a stakeholder community at with something called the Ukraine Recovery Conference. And we helped establish what the key reforms that needed to be enacted in order to move forward on Ukraine's EU membership track. And I think it was a huge success. We saw tremendous progress working through our project with Ukrainians. And if anybody knows, it's a group called RISE Coalition, which is a group of Ukrainian CSOs that has been really front and center even during the reconstruction and recovery period, because we know a lot of money is going into Ukraine to support not only defense and security, macroeconomic support, humanitarian support, and that we also know, based on what the World Bank estimates are, hundreds of billions of dollars will be needed to rebuild Ukraine at the right moment. And so making certain that Ukraine has the infrastructure in place to be able to have donors feel comfortable that money is safeguarded is critically important. We wrote a piece recently on that right before the congressional vote saying, here's how Ukraine has actually made progress and anti-corruption progress, and here's why the United States should continue to support them based on that. So we're working with key partners in civil society, and as part of this project, we're going to be targeting several countries. Guatemala is one country that we're quite focused on right now, and that we'll be looking at countries like Senegal, which just had a recent election. I'm going to be in Zambia in about 2 weeks to also think through, and Zambia is one of the target countries of the US government in terms of support for anti-corruption efforts. So ACDS has these core programmatic activities. We're going to be analyzing the implementation of progress of anti-corruption commitments countries made, including at the Summit for Democracies. We've had 3 Summit for Democracies. I hope there's going to be a 4th. But through that, we saw hundreds of commitments. In fact, the anti-corruption commitments were the highest level of commitments for countries globally. But what we also saw at the last summit was, when we look back, our research, and we wrote a piece on this too, is that many of the commitments that were made were not implemented, or were not actually, the laws weren't passed, they were not implemented. So there's a lot of positive movement in this direction, and our project will continue to monitor and evaluate the implementation of these commitments, and working closely with civil society and local actors and governments to try to help propel the movement forward in those commitments. You asked about one key area, it's actually helping these countries move these commitments forward. Now, the US government has been doing it, but it takes a village to do this globally, and it can't just be the United States alone. It's got to be with partners globally, meaning that when you start to look at development assistance globally, there's several countries that stand out, like the EU or Sweden, UK, but it's not enough. In fact, the bad actors, which we'll talk a little bit about China in these next questions, and that Matthew raised, that Rachel spoke about, they're pouring, when we talk about disinformation or bribery, they're pulling in more money than we are as a country in terms of development assistance. In addition to that, our development assistance is weakened when you have corruption on the ground. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So third, we'll be assessing frameworks for measuring corruption to help provide clarity and consistently measure progress. And we want to also mainstream financial transparency and integrity issues, including transparency and accountability in public procurement. We talked a little bit about that. Globally, when you think about $1 in $3 globally from governments involves some type of procurement, you want to make sure that money is safeguarded in countries. If you think about the numbers, I think the Biden administration highlighted of corruption globally of 2 to 4% annually of GDP, you can imagine how that impacts countries' growth, their democracy, the impact on healthcare, education. And when those things aren't working in countries, and when there's less human insecurity, that's when we create destabilization, spaces for terrorism, spaces for malign actors. And we're seeing this in spaces, including in Africa, where you're seeing strategic corruption wind its way in places where there's vulnerabilities or a history of. And so we have pretty smart oligarchs and autocrats who know how to press in the soft spots in these countries. So we'll be focused on transparency, financial transparency and accountability, building in the work of something called the Summit for Democracy, Financial Transparency and Integrity Cohort that Brookings co-led with the US government, an open government partnership. We seek to pick up on the momentum of the summit and work with multilateral platforms. I'm sure we'll talk about this, including the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, the UN Convention Against Corruption, and other multilateral arenas where we see implementation needed and greater focus on that implementation needed. So we're engaged in efforts to expand this conversation. We'll be convening stakeholders from civil society and creating something called communities of learning and action, where we'll be focused on these issues, both not only at the global level and the national level, but at the subnational level. And I think that's one thing, and I'm gonna end there because I know we need to get to the next round of questions, but we need to also think about what's taking place at the subnational levels, mayors that are dealing with some of these same strategic challenges, procurement, beneficial ownership, enablers of corruption, and think through, one thing that we have seen, and I'll end with this, is a pattern of whether it's China, which is quite sophisticated in how it's using its money abroad. When it realizes that there is a strong central government effort to combat corruption and very hard to penetrate those levels of government, not saying that they're not trying, they tend to go to local levels, to cities. And that, then you see what you end up seeing, and we'll talk a little bit about that, is a pressure that comes from regional, from governors, from places that you wouldn't expect pushing on the national government that have political impact and push. So we have really, we have savvy adversaries in this space. I'm really excited about the opportunity to speak to this, to speak on this panel, but also, to make sure to echo the point that this is a long-term battle and effort. Matthew spoke about sort of the history of corruption, efforts to combat corruption in the United States. And I think it takes a village. And in this case, over the last several years, one of the best things I've seen in a gridlocked United States Congress has been the ability for Congress to actually pass Corporate Transparency Act, legislation dealing with bribery. It's quite amazing. There is interest, there is a push. Hopefully the Enablers Act will sort of make its way back to the legislative table again. That would be important. And the US is so important to this effort because it leads the way not only on anti-corruption, but democracy and human rights. These are all interlinked, and it's in our interest to take this seriously, put the resources into it, and make certain that corrupt actors aren't driving this policy, including here in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I would like to now move forward with looking at specific regions as it relates to the nexus of national security and corruption. Matthew, you provided a great overview of the historical context, looking at Russia's role in this. I think you've also mentioned the weaponization of corruption. Jonathan alluded to strategic corruption and also described Brookings Institution's efforts in assisting civil society in Ukraine and specifically. So I want to pick up on the Ukraine topic. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people here in the US are still critical on the funding efforts in supporting Ukraine's resistance to Russia. A lot of people, quite frankly, say that it may be a waste of American taxpayers' dollars. Matthew, you've been doing some considerable amount of work in Ukraine. Most recently, you were a member of the selection commission for the new head of the National Agency on Corruption Prevention in Ukraine. How would you describe the importance of anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine? And also, do you find that these efforts are effective?
Well, that's a great question, Lamarck, and it's very well framed. And so let me start by saying that the narrative around Ukraine and corruption is highly politicized in this country and often characterized by and fueled by Russian disinformation, and often becomes framed in very distorted ways due to our own domestic politics. So we need to be very careful in our language when we use Ukraine and corruption in the same sentence. We need to be very specific and very precise, and that's our responsibility as civil society, academic, and anti-corruption activists. So, and I will, and then again, we always need to start where I left off with the end of my comments last time, which is that Ukrainians are fighting for a life free from corruption, including not only Russia's strategic corruption, but also local corruption and globalized corruption. So they're fighting and dying every day for this goal. And while they're fighting the Russians, they're also fighting against corruption. And so as Lamarck mentioned, I had the honor of being nominated by USAID and appointed by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine last fall to help lead a commission to select the new head of the National Agency for Corruption Prevention, which is one of 5 Ukrainian anti-corruption institutions that's been created since the Maidan. And in some ways, it's the central institution because its mission is prevention. Its mission is to stop corruption from occurring in the first place. And so it should, in effect, shape the environment and do the change management around a whole of government approach to this. And as you may know, if you follow Ukraine, but if you don't, you'll appreciate the fact that the personnel choice, the leadership choice around who's going to run such an institution is very important. We need to have, whether it's in the United States, Ukraine, or any other country, we need to have very independent people with high integrity running these organizations. And in Ukraine, post-Maidan, the history of that selection process has been mixed. There's been evidence where the oligarchic networks that are a function of the iron law of oligarchy have infiltrated the selection process, and the wrong person has ended up in charge of the anti-corruption mandate of a given institution. And so much attention has been given to the actual selection process, and Ukraine has agreed, to its great credit, to allow for an international dimension to that process. So I was one of 3 international commissioners. There were 3 that were appointed, nominated by the donors, and then there were 3 nominated by the government of Ukraine. And we met for a period of 4 months. We looked at over 65 resumes. And let me just speak to what a positive experience it was. And both in terms of how it was managed from a best practice point of view, but also because of the results. So we had 64 candidates. They were subject to intense integrity vetting and what's called special vetting in Ukraine. The competition over their candidacies was very open. Everything we did in public, we did online. So we literally interviewed candidates online in front of Ukrainian civil society. Ukrainian civil society contributed at every juncture in the process by providing us with information, due diligence, and their own views and recommendations. We conducted, it was a very educational process because we needed to, in effect, help Ukrainian citizens derive more trust in what is happening in their government as a result of this. In some ways, that trust goal is the most important goal that we all, whether it's the United States or Ukraine or other international stakeholders, we need to remain focused on what is required to build trust. And so we took our time through this process. In the end, we were able to choose a Boy Scout. His name is Victor Pavlushik. He has law enforcement experience, but he also had, in addition to having a track record of independence under great pressure as a prosecutor, he also exhibited vision. He showed how he would use change management to do this prevention. And he also had I think, and this is what sort of pushed him over the finish line, a great deal of humility. He did not bring a political agenda to this job, and he brought a great deal of humility and willingness to learn. And so the hardest part about this, by the way, was that we had 10 great candidates at the end. And so it was a little bit difficult to choose between and among them. And we did that all online, and it was all democratic, and the debate over each candidate was conducted that way. So Ukraine met this milestone in the middle of a war. And this is a milestone that they had actually identified for themselves as a goal in February when they issued a kind of roadmap for the rule of law and anti-corruption reforms that they were going to hold themselves accountable to achieve. And they were able to achieve this. This was one of their first. So let me move back to, my point in sharing that is that there is there is much evidence that the spirit of the revolution of dignity lives in every Ukrainian, and that they continue this fight, and that we need always in our discussions to turn the attention back to how Ukrainians themselves are owning this issue. Having said that, we have to level set. The risks around both legacy and new non-legacy corruption are significant. And as we contemplate huge donor streams to Ukraine, what we may see and this has happened in other nations, and this has been well documented, is a kind of organization of new networks around these huge money flows. And so all of that could threaten the new social contract in Ukraine that we hope will not only survive the war, but help win the peace. And so now let me turn this a little bit back to the West, the EU, United States, other international stakeholders, and suggest that we have to be better at how we approach our support of helping Ukrainian civil society own and operate their own anti-corruption agenda based on their track record. We always have to start with what have they already accomplished? What is their asset? Let's not come into this as though, they haven't been successful. Let's start with their success as the foundation point. But as we do that, we need to be constructive in I think in two ways. One is we need to keep in mind that it's Russia's systemic corruption that is driving this war effort and sustaining this war effort from Moscow, okay? It is their desire to create a dependent crony state in Ukraine that is what is driving this war effort at one level. I mean, it's a complex narrative and there are other things at play, but we in the anti-corruption community have to continue to highlight this reality. And so therefore we have to remember that, Russia still has a corruption problem, and we need to keep focused on that as well, right? The other thing we need to do is we need to be more aware, in my view, of the risk of globalized corruption coming into Ukraine. There will be tremendous interest from the private sector, from different governments, from different donors, and there will be huge and significant financial flows. And it will be very important for us to think of what kind of economy we want to see built in Ukraine. Will it be citizen-based? Will it reward entrepreneurship? Will Ukraine become a startup nation? Will they exercise their huge advantage in intellectual capital and digital transformation? I've been working very closely with the Ministry of Digital Transformation for the past 2 years on their efforts to effectively change the culture of governance in Ukraine not just by using digital tools, but by using digital tools in a way that empowers citizens, right? And so when they talk about what they're fighting for, they're talking about fighting for a new way of doing government that could be global, right? And it'll not only be unique to Central Europe, it'll be global if it succeeds. So with all that in mind, I'll just come back to trust. When we speak about the fight against corruption in Ukraine, and that's where we should start. We shouldn't start with corruption in Ukraine is X. We should start with the fight against corruption in Ukraine is Y. We need to keep in mind that the trust of Ukrainian citizens in their own progress and in their own ability to stop this is key to winning the war and winning the peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Matthew, for providing that insight on, Ukrainian efforts in this ongoing war, also the trust that the citizens require of their government and their anti-corruption efforts. I think we'll move on to some questions. We have received a number of questions from our online participants, and 2 questions are practically the same, the question is, what is the US doing about corrupt activities taking place in Eastern DRC? So I will turn that over to Rachel. The strategy states that the US government will pursue pilot programs in the Democratic Republic of Congo, being one country, and in Dominican Republic. But since the question is on the DRC, we'll move to that. And these pilot programs are meant to determine best practices for future interagency coordination. So Rachel, can you describe any efforts the USG has undertaken for this interagency coordinated efforts in Sub-Saharan Africa? Thanks.
Thanks, Lamarck, and thanks to our online participants who asked the question. So I think as Lamarck was pointing out, under Objective 4.4, we have improved coordination and risk analysis across foreign assistance. And this strategy has committed the US government to continue to pursue pilot programs, as Lamarck mentioned, in both the Dominican Republic and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, as a proof of concept to determine best practices for future interagency collaboration. USAID in the Democratic Republic of Congo received approximately $940,000 in FY 2020 development assistance funding from the Anti-Corruption Response Fund, the ACRF. This funding was intended to support a new anti-corruption pilot program to prevent, detect, and mitigate corruption, especially in DRC's precious stones and mineral export sectors. Following extensive interagency consultations, USAID and DRC elected to use the ACRF funding to support a corruption-focused component of a new activity that we refer to as the Good Governance Activity, GGA, which USAID awarded in July 2023 and is scheduled to run until July 2028. The ACRF-funded component of USAID GGA works to improve transparency and accountability in the management of mining revenues. In its first 6 months of operation, the activity identified 20 decentralized territorial entities, ETDs, sub-provincial local government units, for support, and will soon begin providing technical assistance to these ETDs to improve resource management through improved transparency and accountability. Just for the folks online who asked the question, it sounds like you have some Eastern DRC expertise, so I'll just provide a few more details on it, which is that to say that the ETDs are located in Haut-Katanga and Lualaba provinces, where cobalt and copper mines are located, as well as Haut-Uelele and Shopo provinces, sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation of that, where gold mines are located. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. And so we've touched on Sub-Saharan Africa, Ukraine. Jonathan, I want to bring it back to you now. And I think you mentioned briefly about China's impact on U.S. national security and anti-corruption efforts. Could you please unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, thank you. And I hope the project and the DRC is successful. It's a very challenging space, particularly the extractive industries. And it's a good segue to the role of China, what China obviously is looking at when it thinks about its engagement in Sub-Saharan Africa, but globally. So when we pull back this issue, when we think about China, we know that there's a short and long-term strategic objective is one, when we talk about national security, is to challenge the U.S. influence across the globe. And this is done through economic, military, financial, and political means, including corruption as one of their tools. And when we talk about we talk about strategic corruption. And of course, this is done for multiple reasons, both domestically and internationally as well. There's motivations in Beijing, including preserving CCP's governance capacity, defending regime legitimacy, and addressing social problems. So you can see these sort of interplay, both the domestic and the global. We're not going to necessarily go into the domestic side, but it's important to look at that as well, because it is also the closing space, non-democracy, lack of transparency and accountability within the government that partially enables the government and fuels their capacity to stay in power. So the external efforts globally also feed back into the ability for that same government coming back to the government to stay in power as well. So it's advancing multiple objectives, but I think it's quite clear that this, in an area of geostrategic competition, corruption is something that is wielded by China significantly across the globe. And it touches on all these issues that Rachel spoke about, competition in spaces like Ukraine. And I think one of the things that some people have raised about concerns is that in the post-Ukraine sort of reconstruction recovery, that you might find the Chinese government coming in, as they have done globally, with loans, wrapping Ukraine in debt, creating strategic partners on the ground, taking advantage, as Matthew said, of while Ukraine has made progress and tremendous progress. And if you look at its corruption perception index that comes out every year from Transparency International, you can see these two, but even between Russia and Ukraine, you can see Ukraine's moving in the right direction, but will remain vulnerable, as all countries remain vulnerable to the influence of corruption, particularly one that is wielded in a I would say, in a very smart and strategic way by the Chinese. So I mentioned China is like other kleptocracies, and not only seeks to prevent democracy at home, but also democracy abroad. Beijing seeks to advance its interests by wielding corruption as a geopolitical weapon that undermines their adversaries. This includes strategic corruption, corrosive capital, which is we've seen globally, including in Europe. We've seen it through the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'm happy to go more deeply into that. There are patronage networks, opaque business dealings to spread kleptocratic model of authoritarian governance. Make no mistake, there is a competition over models of governance globally, and this is one where Chinese decision-making and the central capacity to make these decisions, unlike the United States, which has an interagency, and if anybody's been sat in interagency meetings, it's tough to make a decision. The Chinese don't have that same lever. They have it centralized, and that means that they can do things and move very quickly. So we know that that we see funding going to ministers or politicians globally. They receive bribes or economic threats. There's censorship of political speech abroad. This means transnational efforts to go after those actors that are opposed to Chinese interests. That means suborning the legitimate sovereign interests entrusted to them by their own people in favor of a foreign power. And we see this corruption involve financial methods of election interference. Matthew, I think you mentioned that. Other taxes of corrupting democratic processes, often funded with the proceeds of kleptocracy. Election interference through covert political financing is something that we are seeing. And if you even listen to more recent statements by Christopher Wray about threats to the US election, they're there. He mentions China, Russia, and other adversaries. So it's there. So I just want to maybe just talk about, obviously about Latin America is one area that we can talk about. And we've seen over the last decade a significant increase in bilateral trade between China and the region. We have seen reinforcing this is a concern of the United States, concern of others, because of the type of funding that's going in and sort of the advantages that the Chinese are taking advantage of in those countries. So China understands Latin America, in many ways understands Latin America better than the US does right now, has a pragmatic approach that fits the profile of Latin American governments and leaders. And so this means when they're looking to engage governments like Nicaragua or in some of these other countries, we've seen shifts even in support, for example, for Taiwan and countries through the use of coercive funding and support in these countries, shifting allegiances. And we know in these spaces that this may also lead to, when we have the hollowing out of government, when we have funding being diverted from governments, including in Central America, this could lead to increased levels of migration, which is a direct threat to US national security. So I'm happy to go deeper into both Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, but we've seen this globally. Matthew touched on Russia, which is also in many of these same spaces as well. And so you have two major global adversaries of the United States that are using corruption to advance their strategic objectives. And I think the whole goal and the focus of this national security strategy is a recognition that these are real, they're having a real impact. And in many cases, when you see democratic backsliding globally, as we've seen over the past 15 years, and numerous indexes globally, you know we're behind the curve, not ahead of it. And so the conversation we're having today is important for that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Since we've had questions online, I would like to now open up to the floor for questions. Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. I'd like to congratulate Scott on organizing this brilliant panel. It's got very fertile ideas for us to apply. Specifically, I'd like to ask Matt Murray and about some of the things that were done in Ukraine and whether they could be applied in Haiti, a current national security challenge facing the U.S. The real problem we have is leverage. And our assistance, pales in comparison to the lucre that elites derive from kleptocratic regimes. So how was the role of IFES mobilized to support making it a conditioning IFE assistance lending on the creation of specifically the high anti-corruption court? Right. But you also spoke of your role as an international identifying members of these organizations. That is a solution that I would submit is not going to work in Haiti because essentially it would smack of international intervention. The Haitian solution is the Haiti problem, Haitian diaspora and Haitian CSOs. How were CSOs mobilized in Ukraine, and how could that model be applied in Haiti?
Well, this is a really good question, and the way I would frame it is that because we work in a environment in which corruption is global, how can we not seek global solutions to the problem wherever they may manifest, whether it's Haiti or Ukraine? And so with due respect to the risk that any corruption, anti-corruption programming or strategy or interventions in Haiti may be interpreted or misconstrued or pushed back because they have an international dimension, at some point this is going to happen. It's going to be inevitable. And so the question then becomes, what are the best practices? How do you massage this into the local environment? And I think Ukraine's a prime example of how to do it. They deserve a lot of credit for how they've been willing to accommodate Western expertise. Sometimes we go overboard. Sometimes we hand them lists of things we want done for very specific bureaucratic reasons here that may or may not be holistic in their approach. And so I'm going to take this moment just to also congratulate you on the great work that you've done under the strategy, and I think this will also address what you're saying, what you're asking about, and that is the hardest part of getting the interagency toolkit right, in my experience, is that we as a government are not organized to counter networks, right? To disrupt and defeat networks. And much corruption is network-based, no matter where it occurs. It's network-based in Haiti, it's network-based in Ukraine. And so you emphasize joint analysis. And that's, I think, where it's in the definition of the problem that we will find the interagency solution, right? So Rachel mentioned that our government is moving in the direction of joint analysis, which I believe means having different departments and agencies view the corruption risk in a given country through a security lens, and then be able to develop first an individual institutional answer to that, and then a whole of government answer to that. That will eventually, logically, lead to organizing and deploying our toolkit in a way that it is just as smart as the networks that we're fighting. And so whether Ukraine or Haiti, that's what it means to be elevating our game and taking it to those authoritarian state-sponsored networks or criminal networks that are the deepest part of the problem.
Yes.
Matthew, thanks for that. And I just want to add a couple of words on Ukraine because I couldn't agree more with everything that you've said. I think the US government has done an enormous amount of work
Yes.
to combat corruption with Ukraine, and want to thank you for your contribution to that. It really does take a village to get this right, so I appreciate that. I just wanted to give you one example, actually, of, I think, quite effective US government interagency collaboration, not only within the interagency, but also across our international partners. And that is with regard to countering the potential, to preventing really at this point, the potential for the illicit transfer of conventional weapons across the many very porous borders of Ukraine. We have, and it's related to the anti-corruption work that we're doing, a US government strategy that we've put together that also is in partnership with many of our partners and allies in the region, to prevent the illicit transfer of conventional weapons. And I think, to your point, many of these illicit networks are the same networks that are used for smuggling anything, you name it, whether it's from cigarettes all the way through more advanced weapons. And so we are working together, and we have seen that interagency coordination and international partnership, and partnership as well with civil societies in these countries, really help to address this multifaceted approach that is required to get this problem right. I agree also, Matthew, that the narrative on Ukraine is critical. And I want to just sort of share a little bit of information about some of the anti-corruption work in Ukraine, which is to say, I think there's a lot of work to do. We have a long road ahead of us, but it is taking effect. It's taking root. Poll after poll shows Ukrainians categorically and overwhelmingly reject corruption and want rule of law. We've seen the government take important steps, often at the international community and Ukrainian civil society's encouragement. Anti-corruption institutions have proven they're capable of confronting high-level corruption and are delivering results. Here's a few examples. Over a dozen high-level officials were dismissed or resigned following allegations of corruption in 2023, including the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine reported an 80% increase in prosecutions from 2022 to 2023, and a 50% increase in indictments. The cases covered by these indictments involved financial losses to Ukraine of close to $800 million. We continue to press the Ukrainian government to move forward with reforms and strengthen anti-corruption institutions. Broadly, as one example of improvement born out of the data, Ukraine has increased its score, this is what Jonathan was referencing earlier, by 11 points out of 100 on the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index over the last decade, demonstrating citizens' belief that the fight against corruption is yielding results. Just one other thought on this that I think sort of ties together the nexus of things that we're seeing internationally, not only in Ukraine, but in Latin America, as you raised, as well as across Africa. And this is really, I think, as we think about combating corruption, there's no question that it's a matter of strategic competition for the US government, but I think it's also a matter of really meeting countries where they are and meeting the needs of those countries. In Latin America, for example, what people really need are US businesses to come in and invest. And that requires that they have the investment climate, that they have the procurement regulations, that they have the financial transparency to enable US businesses to come in. One of the things that we're looking at in Ukraine is providing advisory support to the Ministry of Strategic Industries, which is a key partner of the Ministry of Digital Transformation that Matthew mentioned, specifically to help them identify where are the obstacles to foreign investment, so that we can think about, so that Ukraine can think about how to reform procurement regulations, how to put a regulatory system in place that facilitates foreign investment. When in the defense industry, we think about things like co-production, joint ventures, and how do we sort of incentivize companies to want to come in and do that? There's enough obstacles when we just think about the current context of the war itself. But then when you think about the regulatory or legislative environment, it becomes quite problematic for US businesses to be able to invest in that environment. So really just being able to help identify what are the ways of reform for procurement, for acquisitions, for all of the many pieces of that puzzle has been a key node, not only in Ukraine, but I think in Latin America, across Africa, across most parts of the world that we're working. Thanks.
Thank you. As we'll have to wrap it up soon, so we have 2 more minutes. Jonathan, I know you have a few comments you want to make.
Yeah.
before we wrap up.
Just to answer the question too, it's absolutely important for IFIs to to have anti-corruption conditionality as part of their country plans. That has been the case with IMF, in fact, and also with U.S. funding. In the past, I was at USAID, was part of a group, interagency group that negotiated 3 $1 billion loan guarantees with the Ukrainian government. Some of the conditionality that we put in place was to build out these anti-corruption bodies that Matthew's been working on, and we worked on together. We were both in the Obama administration at the time. So it's absolutely critical. I think the one area I think the U.S. government is better now at coordinating that effort with multiple partners, because in Ukraine there's multiple IFIs and also bilateral donors that are there. U.S. is also, and I think I know it was I think it first officially leaked, but even as it relates to the current tranche of funding, there's certainly conversations right now. A leaked document last fall that lists a number of conditionality and commitments that the U.S. government wants to see Ukraine take. I'm not going to go into that because I don't know if that's the sort of the official point right there, but it's really important to know that it continues to be a part of that response. And of course, it should be part for IFIs as well. And of course, Haiti's got many difficult challenges on the ground. And I think there's been multiple efforts over many years to try to address some of these deep-rooted economic and political and democracy-related challenges. I think that, finding the right moment in time, one could even argue about Ukraine. It took many years, over 3 decades of U.S. support for, and not only just the U.S., the EU, others globally supporting Ukraine's democracy, the building of a civil society that's been capable of doing what it's doing, having the security and at times economic security to sort of move the needle forward, took many decades. And Haiti is certainly deserves attention and focus. I work for a member of Congress from South Florida. We dealt a lot with this issue in addressing these challenges and work closely with the Haitian American community as well. We want to see that success there, but right now there's that instability. And one thing we did find is when governments are opposed to, when there is instability, government instability, lack of security, no space for civil society or independent media, it's very difficult to move the needle forward. And in the end of the day, it's always about the citizens of that country and their progress. We can do our part externally, and we should. We shouldn't be enabling corruption, Putin's corruption in the United States, by having in place his dirty money, in the United States or in any partner of Ukraine. We can do our part. We can provide assistance. And Matthew, thank you for being on that commission and being there to help them progress. But it's going to be the people of those countries, as you're seeing in Georgia today, with tens of thousands of people, who have been protesting, who are fighting, who have the same scores. If you look at the polling in Georgia, they overwhelmingly want democracy. They oppose corruption, but they have a government that's moved in a completely different direction. These are the reality and challenges, and it's also a lesson learned for any country about when you open the door to that type of corruption in government, how difficult it is to get rid of that and address that challenge.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I want to thank our esteemed panelists, Matthew, Rachel, Jonathan, for providing your insightful comments and remarks on this very pressing topic. And, to take Rachel's words, it takes a village to get this right. It takes the village domestically with the U.S. government coordination. It takes a village with U.S. government working with CSOs that are pushing this fight, and also reform-minded government. So thank you very much for the participation and for the wonderful questions from our audience. Thank you.